When you need mealtime inspiration, it's worth shopping Kroger for thousands of appetizing ingredients that inspire countless mouthwatering meals. And no matter what tasty choice you make, you'll enjoy our everyday low prices. Plus, extra ways to save, like digital coupons worth over $600 each week and up to $1 off per gallon at the pump with points. So you can get big flavors and big savings. Kroger, fresh for everyone. Fuel restrictions apply.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Underrated Movie Podcast. This is a podcast where we discuss films that are underrated, underappreciated, and ones that have gone under the radar and passed most people by. Today, we're going to be talking about the 2015 film The Man from U.N.C.L.E, directed by Guy Ritchie, based on the 1960s TV show of the same name, starring Henry Cavill, Armie Hammer, Alicia Vikander, and Elizabeth Debicki. Joining me to discuss this film is another film podcaster and an all-around great guy, the host of Backlook Cinema, Zoe Richardson. How's it going, Zoe?
Hello, how are you doing? I'm doing great. How about yourself?
I'm doing swell. You know, I really enjoyed this movie, and I'm excited to have you on and talk about it with you. But yeah, man, you do a film podcast yourself. As I mentioned, you know, I've been lucky enough to be on that. You know, before we get into it, what did you want to let the people know about yourself and your podcast?
Well, as you said, it's called Backlook Cinema, the podcast. And we watch movies, or we take a look back at the movies of yesteryear. We watch movies that we all loved from the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And just a lot of the more popular films, mostly the films that I'm more familiar with. So I'm just basically using the podcast as a chance to rewatch some of my favorite movies. We cover like most genres, and we delve into the trivia, the behind the scenes, and we just talk about what we really loved about those movies.
Yeah, it's a great time, and you know, I had a blast being on that. We talked about Amadeus, one of my all-time favorite movies, and it's great because that podcast talks about movies I'd never would get a chance to talk about because you got some certified classics over there. But yeah, you guys, you have such great show notes and information stuff. I loved the introduction that you gave me when I guested, so it was a lot of fun. That was a good one, but you definitely know your shit about movies. I will say that for sure. And so, you know, I wanted, of course, to have you on this show, and the movie that you chose to talk about is, of course, The Man from U.N.C.L.E. You said you hadn't seen it before this, right?
Yeah, I knew that it was a TV show, but I had never watched the show. And I've seen the trailers when it was first being marketed, and I thought, well, that'd be a good film to check out, but I just never got around to seeing it. So it was the great excuse to get around to finally watching that film.
Nice, because I feel like that's a lot of people's experience with this movie, where they're like, "Oh yeah, I remember that one," but like a lot of people haven't seen it, never got around to it. They were like, "Yeah, it seemed good. I just never had a reason to watch it." So hopefully that's what this episode will do is get more people to watch it. But what were your impressions of the movie now having seen it?
Well, the first thing I thought was that this was Henry Cavill's audition for James Bond.
I had the same thought. That's amazing. Yeah, absolutely.
That was my very first thought, because
Yeah.
I don't know how hard he was campaigning for the role, but I knew that he was one of the actors that was up for that role, and I don't even think they've chosen, or they settled on who they wanted to play the new Bond. But
Yeah.
this was definitely a 2-hour audition tape for him, and I thought he did very well. Like, I wouldn't be mad if they chose him for James Bond. And I thought it was I like the combination of cheeky humor they had and the action that they had. And it really started off, they were really going for the spy aspect of the spy thriller.
Mhm.
So, like people not knowing that they're spies, right? And
Right,
it's not
right.
like James Bond where it's like within the first act, people figure out who James Bond is. And it's different in this movie.
Yeah, no, that's the thing about that I really enjoy about this movie is that it's a real spy thriller. A lot of the James Bond movies are kind of spy action movies. Even a movie that I think are movies that are kind of similar to this because they're also based on a '60s spy show, something like Mission Impossible. Those are spy action movies. A lot of that spy stuff is more action adventure stuff, whereas this is definitely a thriller. There's these twists and turns, and it's very stylized in the '60s. It's got that kind of Guy Ritchie sheen on it. This is a very, very there's I feel like there's some Guy Ritchies that are a little less Guy Ritchie, like his remake of Aladdin, for example. And then there's some Guy Ritchies that really lean into like what he does best, what he loves to do, doing all this sleek spy stuff, having these characters throwing out all these quips, and then it's actually be like, well, actually, it was this thing the whole time, and Elizabeth Debicki is about to blow up. I think it really handled all that well, and like you said, this, like, it's like, yeah, after seeing this movie, you're like, man, Cavill needs to be Bond, because I think, interestingly enough, he did audition the last time there was a new Bond, but he was like 23. So, like, he's really good, but he's way too young to be Bond. But now he's about 40, so he would be the right age to play Bond when they rebooted it. Maybe they reboot it and they set it in the '60s or something. Because yeah, this was great. I really thought he was great. I thought the whole cast was pretty great. Alicia Vikander, obviously great. Elizabeth Debicki, really good. It's just like a very different kind of villain that you don't see, very sinister in a different way. And then Hugh Grant was good, and it's interesting because it's almost like an origin story for, I guess, what would become the premise of the TV show, where it's like these two guys, a Russian and an American, working together to kind of solve all these international crimes. So I was very interested in that. But are you a Guy Ritchie fan at all?
I don't know. Like I've seen a couple of Guy Ritchie films,
Yeah.
but I don't. It's not like I'll go to the movies because Guy Ritchie directed them. With
Mm,
me, it's more. It's more just maybe a coincidence, you might say. Like I might
mhm.
go to a movie and I might like it, and it's like, oh, by the way, it was directed by Guy Ritchie. It's like, oh yeah, that's a good film. But I can't say that I've seen a whole bunch of Guy Ritchie movies.
Yeah, well, he puts out so much stuff that inevitably you're gonna see some and you're gonna miss some, just because he comes out with at least one movie a year. I feel like sometimes two. Like he's got a couple things in the can already that are going to be coming out in the next year or two. He had two movies that came out last year. He had a movie that came out this year, which also had Henry Cavill, by the way. That was, I'm forgetting now. But
Ungentlemanly warfare.
yes,
Yeah,
the Ministry of Gentleman Warfare. Thank you. Yeah, which I thought
yeah.
was great, but like this one, kind of severely underperformed at the box office. And yeah, this one, while it did okay critically, it got more positive-ish reviews. Like, you could say mixed. It had like I think a 68 or something on Rotten Tomatoes, but it just bombed at the box office, both domestically and internationally, which is a shame, because I think that this movie was quite a bit of fun. But I think sometimes with Richie, it's like, I think he's able to make so many movies because he makes them not cheap, but relatively cheap, under $100 million. And sometimes they won't they won't hit, but sometimes they just make a ton of money. So they keep letting him make these movies. He does a one for them, one for me, and this was, I feel like, clearly a one for me.
Yeah. And Ministry for Ungentlemanly Warfare. That was another one that I wanted to see that I
Mhm.
didn't get around to seeing.
Yeah, that one I had a lot of fun with. That one is definitely more action. That one's like, just kind of ratchets up the action to ridiculous degrees, where they're like, okay, Henry Cavill looks small compared to Alan Richardson, because that's how, like, it's just big dudes like running around shooting bows and arrows into people and blowing up German subs and all this stuff. It's kind of like in Guy Ritchie's Inglorious Bastards. But yeah, this he clearly has his stuff that he likes, and every once in a while I get to do it. It's interesting, I think, that even this movie kind of gets made because looking at the development history a little bit, it's something that bounced around from director to director. You know, it was a movie that was going to be made for a little while by one of Guy Ritchie's buddies, Matthew Vaughn. I know Steven Soderbergh was going to take a crack at it for a little while. David Dobkin was going to work on it. And so it's interesting because these guys all have some, like, you can draw parallels between all of them. You know, watching this movie, it reminded me a little bit of something like Ocean's 12, Soderbergh's Ocean's 12, which is also set in Italy, and it's got that kind of same soundtrack, that same kind of like, we're doing action stuff, but here's like a fun little quip and stuff like that. So I thought stylistically, I was a big fan. What did you think of the whole style, the whole '60s vibe, all that stuff?
Yeah, I really enjoyed that. I didn't realize that it was going to be. No, actually, I don't even know if I was expecting the '60s or not. But I really, it felt vibrant because normally when you're
Mm.
looking at something that's shot, trying to make it look like it's in black and white, or maybe it looks old because they try to ape the style of
Mm.
filmmaking from the '60s, but it felt very modern. That like a very modern movie that just so happened to be shot in the '60s, and it felt so rounded. Like the cars
Mm.
they were boxy, but they were rounded at the corners, and I feel like that aesthetic was found throughout the movies, and then it really highlighted the fashion. That was really what popped out to me was the fashion, and it was funny because
Yeah.
the two leads actually had an argument over fashion that carried over to a portion of the movie. So the overall style of the cars, the well, not necessarily the architecture, but stuff like the furniture,
Mm.
the the styles of telephones that they had, with some of the appliances. And I think they really did do a lot of attention to detail. Like I'm not a '60s aficionado. I couldn't tell you if the stuff is accurate, but it just looks good to me that it kind of harkened back to that age in a way that it made it look fresh. Like I can see somebody watching this movie and being inspired to bring back some of the style that they saw in this movie because they really highlighted all of the things that je ne sais quoi that made the '60s great.
Yeah, it did look incredible. You know, all that '60s style looked great. You know, there's a point when like Elizabeth and Becky picks up this old like '60s phone and it's got the little rotary on the bottom, and you're like, oh, that's
Yeah,
cool. And
yeah.
the, all the like the suits and like the dresses, and like Alicia Vikander's got these big sunglasses, and the film ends on kind of this like silhouette of them, and even in silhouette you can tell that they're wearing like very '60s fashion. And so I loved all of that. I love the music that goes along with that because it feels very '60s, but in a modern way. It doesn't feel like they were just like you said, not exactly kind of cribbing the style, but giving you this kind of '60s vibes through a modern lens. And you mentioned that they have this argument recurring throughout the film of between them about the fashion and stuff like that. And it's like kind of a wider thing about how these characters are constantly bickering and arguing. And at the beginning, it starts with this kind of, I would say, rivalry, but with a respect for each other. You know, it starts with them basically trying to kill each other, but them seeing each other like, okay, I know I'm the best at what I do. I see that you're also one of the best at what I do. So we're trying to kill each other, but respect. We're on different sides, but we respect each other. And then it's like, okay, we got to work with each other, and it's almost like a brotherly thing. It kind of develops like that in the movie, where it's like, all right, they're always trying to like one up each other and stuff like that. But over the course of the movie, they build this real bromance and respect for one another, which culminates in, I really like the ending where, because you have the whole climax of the movie with all the action stuff and the guy getting stabbed, and then there's the boat scene, and then there's almost like a little extra climax. The denouement is almost like a little exciting stuff where it's like, okay, now the two of them are going to maybe have to face off because they both want this disc that is essentially the key to unlocking this technology that both of their governments want. and are they going to fight? What's going to happen? You know, you've seen these guys grow closer throughout the film, and you have Ilyich, I believe is his name, or Kuyan. I can never pronounce all these Russian names, but you know, the
Oh
Army
Lord.
Hammer character. he he's like he's kind of like smashes up his room, and he's kind of like implied to be maybe have some sociopathic tendencies. And then Cavill gives him this watch, which has been so important to his character throughout the whole film. And it's this nice little MacGuffin, and he tosses it to him, and they see that they have this respect, and then it just kind of cuts to them destroying the thing. And I was just like, man, if only like really governments could work together like this, you know, instead of like trying to one up each other and fight each other. And I thought that scene where it's just like, you know, Hugh Grant's like, oh, it's starting a bonfire when they're just burning the chip or whatever.
Right,
I
right,
thought
right.
that scene just so economically and simply did something that a lot of movies spend their entire runtime trying to do. Did you see that movie? I'm spacing on the name again, but it was the movie. It was like this space station. Oh, it's called ISS, and it was this movie about like a space station where there's Russians and Americans, and they each have to take control of the space station. And it's fun for what it is, but that movie spends its whole runtime trying to do what they do in this one scene, and that really speaks to how good of a director Guy Ritchie is, I think.
When you need mealtime inspiration, it's worth shopping Kroger for thousands of appetizing ingredients that inspire countless mouthwatering meals. And no matter what tasty choice you make, you'll enjoy our everyday low prices. Plus, extra ways to save, like digital coupons worth over $600 each week and up to $1 off per gallon at the pump with points. So you can get big flavors and big savings. Kroger, fresh for everyone. Fuel restrictions apply.
This podcast is supported by FX's English Teacher, a new comedy from executive producers of What We Do in the Shadows and Baskets. English Teacher follows Evan, a teacher in Austin, Texas, who learns if it's really possible to be your full self at your job while often finding himself at the intersection of the personal, professional, and political aspects of working at a high school. FX's English Teacher is now streaming on Hulu. All new Mondays on FX.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, to speaking to how they were trying to kill each other in the beginning, because they're in Germany, they're on opposing sides, they're both
Mhm,
trying to, it seems like, capture the same woman. And
mhm.
it's like, so yeah, they really are trying to kill each other. But at one point, when the Russian is like holding on to the back of the car, and the woman is like, shouldn't you just shoot him? And he says, I it doesn't even seem fair at this point. It's like, and then he refers to the Russian as like being superhuman because
Mhm.
the Russian was holding onto the back of the car while the car was driving, and then and it's not like he loses grips, but it's like he's holding on to the trunk, like
Yeah,
the back, what do you call it? Like the
like the
handle of the
spoiler
trunk.
or whatever.
Yeah, and then the whole trunk comes off, which is which allows the American and the German to get away. But
Yeah, Napoleon Solo, by the way, is a one of the great. I know that's from the show, but like, I think that's such a great name, especially for like a spy gentleman thief. Like, that's such a cool name for a character.
yeah, also he had an unusual origins because he was
Mm.
in the military, and then while he was in the military, he became a thief. It
Mhm.
started, stealing some high profile things, and then he got caught. And I think he spent a few years in jail, and then he was recruited by the CIA,
Yeah.
and that's how he came to work for the spy agency. So, and
Mhm.
then the Russian had a more traditional he had a more traditional origin, although he had some family troubles, and I like
Mhm.
how they did the exposition for it. It's like basically them. Well, the exposition for the American Spy was more what you would expect from a
Right.
movie,
They're
where
doing
they
like the
kind of are like,
slideshow. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, they while he's on a mission, they kind of explain his origin, but then they do the origin for the Russian, where the American is telling the Russian his own story because after their encounter and they're forced to work with each other, he says that, I had to read up on you to find out more about you. And he tells the Russian his whole origin story. And because the Russian's family is like problematic, like he's
Yeah.
had a troubled past. And so he wants to fight after that. He has problems controlling his emotions. Like every time they show his hands start trembling, it's like he's about to fight. So that was like a nice touch for this movie to see. It was like a visual cue whenever he's about to lose control. You see his hands start trembling. It's like, oh, it's about to be a fight.
Yep, yep. And I love that because they build that up and set that up so well for it to be when that happens at the end, when he's smashing everything up, and it's right after his superior, whatever, is like, don't disgrace the motherland like your father did in Siberia, blah, 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 whatever. And then it's like, okay, that really sets you up to be like, is this going to be like a big final fight? And then it just diffuses all that tension when Cavill, because you can tell like how much he loves his father, but how like disgraced he is by what happened to him. And his superior is using that information to goad him on, to try to get him to persuade him into violence and stuff like that. And Cavill kind of takes the opposite approach, where he gives him back the watch, which is also associated with his father, and that de-escalates things, and it shows how much their characters have grown to care about each other. And I love also the nickname that he has for Solo when he's like cowboy. Like I don't know why, but I love that he's like, whenever he says in his thick, obviously fake Russian accent, cowboy, and it's kind of like a insult a little bit at the beginning, because he's like, okay, he's this kind of reckless American guy, but at the end it's a very much a term of endearment by the end of it, when they're working together, and you get to see them all kind of join up on this team along with the Alicia Vikander character, who's is very interesting. She's kind of like the East German who gets recruited by both of them, but it turns out she's also actually working for the British, was working for the British all along. We thought she betrayed them, but she's actually was working for a third spy agency, and then they all kind of come together at the end and form this new thing, which was clearly setting up a sequel that will never happened, because
Right.
obviously this movie did not do well, and since then other things have happened that will make a sequel definitely not happen involved
Right, right,
with
right.
one
At
of the
least
actors.
not with all
Yeah,
the original stars, no.
yeah, exactly. Cavill's coming back, maybe Alicia Vikander, Hugh Grant, but maybe not not
Yeah,
everybody else. Yeah,
Army
Army.
Hammer is in a bit of trouble. Like, and
Yeah,
he was fantastic in this movie, like with his accent and everything. Like, I don't know if his accent was authentic, but it sounded real to me. Like, it was good enough for an American audience, and it felt so natural. Like, he didn't look like he was trying to put on an accent. It looked like it was just flowing out of him quite naturally. So I really enjoyed that.
mhm,
He's playing the stoic, serious professional that is
right.
just trying to get the job done, and while the opposite, you have Napoleon. He's more relaxed. He's still professional, but more relaxed, and then trying to do some things on the side. Like, he's stealing stuff on the side while at the same time doing his spycraft. So he's he's like he's banging all the babes. He's really into the James Bond of it all.
Yeah, and I think that's such a great dynamic between the two of them, right? Because you have, the more serious stoic, the mission, first like Russian who, it like kills him when he's like, "Hey, you've got to get jumped," like Cavill tells him like take it
Yeah,
like a
yeah,
pussy, and he's just like he has to like still punch the guy in the throat, and it just
yeah,
like burns him up inside. But then you have Cavill who's kind of the more free willing, like you said, James Bond, gentleman thief kind of guy who's they're both incredible at what they do, but they do it so differently. And of course, you have Hammer, who is ironically more like a sledgehammer, and then Cavill, who's just kind of like smash and go in and stuff. And Cavill, who's like he's like the guy he's like, all right, I'm gonna crack the safe. He's gonna find another way around it. When he's like, hold on, cowboy, I'm gonna drive this boat. Like Cavill's like, all right, slips out and gets in the car and it's like, all right, play some tunes, and then crashes in. And so they each have he's more, precise and just kind of like, all right, let me just try it this way and do something a little more offbeat. So the pairing between the two of them, that, odd couple almost dynamic, I thought really helped this movie stand apart. It being a two-hander, most spy movies I feel like are not two-handers. They're either there's one guy or there's like a team. And this is kind of
yeah,
a team
yeah.
because you have Alicia Vikander there, but I think it's really mainly the two of them. and their interplay is really just kind of the driving force of the film.
Yeah. Yeah, they're a team, but they're barely working together, and that's
Hmm.
what kinda made it enjoyable, their adversarial relationship, how they're getting into these verbal quips back and
Hmm.
forth all the time while they're trying to do their work. Like, as I said, the Russian is, like, serious, but the American Napoleon has comes up to him like, so you have the Russian and the German girl, and they're supposed
Hmm.
to pretend to be husband and wife, and they're supposed to be on mission, and they're in country on mission, and the Russian and Napoleon are not supposed to know each other, but then the American rolls up on the bike and says, "You got a couple of guys following you, and they're going to test you. So you
Hmm.
gotta." And they're not looking like they're going to see if you're spies. So you can't do your spy craft on these guys. You gotta act like a regular tourist. You gotta act like you're you're afraid, like they're going to rob you. You have to, and you have to let them rob you. And
Hmm.
and the Russian were like, "This is not what Russia would do. This is very un-Russian like." And it's like, "Well, you gotta do it."
Yep, yep. And I love that kind of just like East meets West mentality. Like I love it whenever like a buddy duo movie does that kind of thing where it's like these people from these two different cultures and one is the more serious one and one is the more like, hey, like actually if we do it this way it'll work, you know. Like obviously Rush Hour did that really well. One of my favorite film series of all time, Shanghai Noon and Shanghai Nights. I think with Owen Wilson and Jackie Chan, it does the same kind of thing where Owen Wilson's like he's the literal cowboy, and then Jackie Chan is like this imperial guard who's much more stoic and is like, you've got to go about it this way, and there's no joking around. And that's always I think a really fascinating dynamic, and this movie pulls it off. I think spectacularly, and yeah, it is a shame. I think that more people did not get a chance to see this one. I don't know if it was like mismarketed or what, or if it was just something where there wasn't really an appetite for an adaptation of this show. Like people like it's like one of those things. Like I feel like they always try to make these movies that are adaptations of shows that like dads loved in the '60s, you know. And other than Mission Impossible, nothing really ever works out with those kind of adaptations, you know.
Well, it's kinda hit or miss because you have the most
Mhm.
famous one of all, Star Trek, and that seemed to have worked out. And then you
That's
have
true. That's true. But
right.
that's sci-fi. You know, that's not exactly a spy thriller.
Yeah, it's not a spy thriller. And then you had, like, 21 Jump Street was a hit. Starsky and Hutch was not so much a hit.
Yeah.
And then there was another one, The Fugitive, that was a hit, although they only made 1
Fugitive.
sequel.
Yeah, you know what? Fugitive was pretty good. Like that was a great movie. I'll give you that. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So it's like any other movie franchises, it's a hit or
Hmm.
miss, and it's mainly the story. I don't think it's because people didn't have advertised for it. I think that there were some deficiencies in this story. So,
Hmm.
like the plot was a little much, right? It was a little hard to hang on to, especially for me. So, I don't want to say that it's all the way convoluted, but they could have did a better way of showing the double cross or things of that nature because it can lose people if it gets a little too confusing. So, or if there are too many elements, maybe if this movie had simplified the elements just a little bit, it probably would not have shed as much audience as it had. But that was the only thing that I really saw. That Well, the other thing was that it was almost like an almost romance between the Russian
Hmm.
character and the German, but it never quite like happened. But their relationship was so adversarial in the beginning that it's kind of hard to tell if this progressed naturally. It's like they're fighting at first, and then but they're making lovey dovey eyes at each other, and you kind of wondering if because they're kind of adversarial all the way through. They're from 2 different countries, and the woman is living in the worst part of Germany, right? Which is
Yeah,
controlled by
yeah.
the Russians. So, it's hard to say whether this relationship between the 2 is supposed to make sense. So that's kind of hard to hang on to. So, there were some deficiencies that the movie had that the audience probably had a hard time with.
Yeah, I think I wonder if because I mentioned that it was going to be directed by Soderbergh, and there's part elements that do feel very Soderberghian, and that climax, where it's like, okay, we're going to show you what was actually happening. We were zeroing it. That feels like that's almost maybe something that was left over, carried over, I should say, from some Soderbergh drafts or something like that. Because I think the reason he backed out was he didn't think that the movie had enough of a budget to actually portray the 60s. So I think it's really impressive that Vaughn was able to make this look so good, like make it a period piece that looks like this, like you said, everything from, the cars to the telephones to the clothing, the street lamps, whatever. Like it all looks like it's set in the 60s. So they did a really good job with that. I think the romance that you spoke of between Vikander and Hammer was a pretty. It was interesting because it was a classic lovers to enemies, Ilya and Gabby. So they start off kind of like very adversarial, but slowly, because I was like, at first I was like, okay, like is it going to be like a love triangle? But Cavill, Solo is kind of out there just doing his own thing. He's not looking for anything serious. He's just like, you're hot, and it's funny because it's like doing all this, like he's sleeping with this woman for the mission, but it's also like he's probably having a good time too. I love that scene when Ilya bugged him and he's like listening in, and you kind of hear the sounds for a second, and then the chandelier just kind of tinkles for a bit, and it's like, all right, that's good filmmaking. It's kind of getting across exactly what's going on. But I thought, yeah, the romance between them kind of developed slowly enough that it worked out for me at least. But I could see the somewhat, I wouldn't say convoluted, but a labyrinthian maybe is the better word, plot being a little bit of a turn off to people. I don't know. Do you think that was the whole reason why this one underperformed? Or do you think there was anything else contributing to that?
Well, I'm not sure. I hadn't read any reviews or anything, so I don't know what people are saying. I'm only
Mhm.
saying, like, from my experience, that it
Right.
was, like I said, it was a little hard to hold on to. So there were some confusing elements. There are times when I didn't know who was working for who or what
Mhm.
people were really doing. I mean, only for like a moment. It was like I generally got what was happening, but there were times when it was like I had difficulty following. That was my experience with the movie.
Yeah, there's a couple moments when it's a little bit like, okay, she's betrayed them, no, but actually she's working for Hugh Grant, and also, okay, which they have the bomb, but it's the wrong. There's a couple moments like that where it's kind of like you gotta. This is a movie where you kind of gotta really be paying attention. So I could see
Yeah.
this not being the greatest movie if you're like just gonna flip on Netflix to have something on and kind of be on your phone. Because if you miss something, you'll be like, what's even happening? But yeah, overall, I really liked this movie. This is just like, I don't know. It feels like a movie that doesn't get made a ton anymore. Like they still exist, obviously. And this isn't, like we said, it's based on something. It's not original IP or anything. But yeah, it's kind of that mid-budget movie that is kind of sleek. It's very much in a director's style. Guy Ritchie feels like he's one of the few people who is allowed to kind of make these movies because he does make the ones for them. The Aladdins, I know he's attached to making the Hercules remake as well. I don't know what the status of that is, if that's still happening, but he was for a while. But then he'll like last year, he made his movie The Covenant, which made a lot of movie in the same year that he made his movie Ruse de Guerre or whatever it was called, and one of those movies did well and one didn't. So it's like, all right, well let him keep making his movies. But yeah, just a movie kind of like this where it's stylized. It's just got some movie stars in it doing their thing, and unless it's already been a big franchise like Mission Impossible, it feels like sometimes these are a little bit harder to get off the ground.
Yeah, yeah. It helps to have like some charming performers. Like so, Henry Cavill was
Mm.
incredibly charming. Army Hammer, even though he was he wasn't a villain, but he was definitely stoic. Like he had a
Mm,
villain like
yeah.
demeanor, and he was also charming in his own way. The women were absolutely fabulous in this movie. So especially, I forgot her name, the one with the blonde hair. I was like, oh,
Oh, Alicia Vikander,
that's a
yeah,
meatball.
yeah. Yeah, yeah.
So, yeah, and then, the fashion that goes on top of it, and then they had some great sequences. So, one of my favorite sequences is that, the 2 spies are trying to get away from this, facility, and they end up
Mhm,
on boats. The Russian is, like, driving the boat, and he's trying to show off his fancy boating skills. It's like, "Watch
mhm.
this, cowboy," and then in one of the turns, the cowboy falls
He's
off and he
already
ends up
off
in
the
the
boat
water.
by that point, I think is so funny.
Yeah, and then he's already off the boat at that point. But yeah, when he makes the turn before that, and Cowboy falls off the boat. So then
Mhm.
Solo swims to shore, or he ends up on shore, and then he ends up on a truck, and then he's just watching the bad guys chase around the Russian in their boat, like shooting up his boat and everything. And he's like having a picnic because somebody
Yeah.
left their lunch in the truck, and he's having a drink and having a sandwich, just watching the whole thing play out. And then when the chase is over and they blow up the Russian's boat and the Russian is in the water, then he drives the truck into I guess it's a lake. Yeah, it felt like a lake to me. It could have been the ocean. But he drives the
Mhm.
truck into the water. He happens to drive on top of the boat that had been chasing him and shooting at the Russian boat. Then he dives into the water and rescues the Russian. And it's almost like he had to make a decision as to whether or not he should rescue this Russian.
Right, yeah. Yeah, that's a great scene, and I think it kinda comes right there in the middle of the movie. And I think that's a really pivotal scene because I think it's the moment when both of them kind of decide that they respect each other, right? Because,
Yeah.
you know, it seems like at that point Napoleon's like he's gonna let him die. He's like, all right, well, good. I don't have to deal with this guy anymore. I kind of got saddled with him. But then he sees that this guy is kind of like doing all these heroics, like trying to like, save, like he's actually genuinely really trying. And he's like, all right, well, I guess I had my sandwich. I'm going to drive in and save this guy, pulls him out of the water and everything. And at that because right before that, they're having all this bickering and stuff like that. Then, once he gets saved, he's like, all right, maybe this American guy is he's all right. And it almost is structured a romantic movie where you have like them like meeting in this kind of like meet cute big thing, and they're like slow, they start off hating each other, but then something happens in the middle and they're like, oh, but this person's not so bad. It's interesting that it's structured in that same way where you're hitting all the same beats, and that's a really important beat right there in the middle. And it's also just a great scene. I love all the split screen stuff that they do throughout the movie, but also in a lot in that sequence. So yeah, just a really great structured just the action, and this is great. We talked about it being more of a spy thing, but there is still some good action stuff. I was like, while this movie it got lukewarm, mostly good reviews, not all good reviews. There were some people that were really high on this. There was apparently Rolling Stone put out in their list of the 50 best action movies of all time. It just made the list at number 50. I think that speaks to, this being exactly the kind of movie that I would want to cover here. A movie that it's not like a disaster. People know what it is, but it's kind of niche. It's kind of one that it falls into that third category that I talk about. It really went under the radar. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah, I think so exactly. And I think it definitely could have had a larger audience,
Hmm.
especially with the type of action they had, the how stylized it was. I especially like the relationship between the characters. That was all. It was like it's cute watching them interact with each other. Like the
Yeah.
attraction between the Russian and the German, that's cute. Or the bickering between all three of the characters, that was cute, right? So,
Yeah.
and those are my favorite moments in the movie when they get into it's not even like an out and out shouting argument, just more like a difference of opinion. Like when they were having that conversation about the type of dress that in the beginning when they were trying to get their outfits for the German woman, she's supposed to be the fiance of the Russian, and he's like, "Well, a Russian woman would never wear that." And then it's like,
Mhm.
so they get to like an argument about fashion, about what she's supposed to be wearing, right? And so that was one of the things that's really funny and charming about this movie. And so they have discussions like that. The characters have a discussion like that, like all throughout the movie. And of course, they have the bickering with the bad guys, but it's like the same kind of banner because they all kind of
Mhm.
have an adversary relationship with each other. So
Yeah.
they're all kind of bickering and whatnot with each other. So it's really fun. The dialogue is really it's really fun to listen to.
Yeah, and it's one of those movies when it gets to the end, and I didn't see this in theaters either. I saw it a few years ago, so I knew that this movie had not done well financially, so I knew that there was going to be no sequel. And it's a bummer because you watch this movie, it really does feel like an origin story for this thing. It ends with them being like, and we're setting up the new thing, Uncle, and then it kind of like freeze
Yeah.
frames or whatever, and you're like, oh, I want to see that. I want to see like this movie did so much good work with establishing these character dynamics, and that was all really great and fun to watch. And at the end, it's like, okay, cool, they're all set. Now I want to see that movie, and it's a shame we never will. There could be a really good sequel out there, but like as we said, for a number of reasons, not just financial, it's probably never going to happen, which is too bad. I mean, who knows? Guy Ritchie makes so many movies a year. Henry Cavill would, I think, probably be game for it, but doesn't seem like it's in the cards, unfortunately. But yeah, man. I don't know. Any other stray thoughts you had on the Man from U.N.C.L.E?
Well, the only one is another scene that I really like. So this is a
Mm,
scene where this is the part where the American, the cowboy,
mm,
he's captured by the bad guys and he's strapped to a chair and they're torturing him with an electrical device. It's
mhm,
kind of like it's like an electric chair and the scientist, who made the chair, like he gets off on torturing people.
mhm.
But it's like I don't want to say it's jury rigged, but there's something wrong with the wiring. So he's trying to torture his victim, and then it doesn't work. So he has to go to another part of the room and reconnect the wires to make sure that it's working right. And
Mhm.
then it starts working correctly, and he goes on with the torture and whatnot. So at the at the end, while he's trying to torture his victim, the Cowboys' Russian partner comes in, comes in behind him, and then they turn the tables and they strap him into the chair, and they and they immediately start torturing him. And then they're trying to decide whether or not they want to keep him alive so that he could be a cooperative witness because he already said that they didn't have to torture him. He was going to give up everything. It's like I will tell you everything
Yeah,
right now.
like
There's
on a
no need for
dime.
the
He's
torture.
like, "I'll turn in people I don't even know."
Right, right. He's like he's definitely the type that could dish it out and not take it. So,
Yeah.
the American and the Russian, they step out of the room and they start talking about what they're going to do with him, like what the final disposition is. It's wavering back and forth whether they should kill him or whether they should keep him alive. And then while they're having this discussion in the room behind the closed door, this thing malfunctions. Like nobody's torturing him, nobody's doing anything. He's just strapped into a chair. But because it's so poorly constructed, it starts issuing electrical shocks, and it
Yeah.
doesn't. So he's being tortured, and then next thing that a fire starts because of an electrical short. Now he's burning to death and being electrocuted, and they don't notice any of this until the glare of the fire draws their attention, and
Yeah.
they look, and it's like, well, now they don't have to decide whether or not to kill him.
Bleh.
He's burnt to toast. So I like these moments in the movies. This I think that it could have maybe had some better connective tissue from moment to moment because they had a lot of really great moments that were spectacular. So that I really enjoyed, and I ended up buying the movie because it was on sale. So
Nice.
it's definitely something where I'll probably end up watching again.
Nice. That's always a good recommendation when you actually buy the movie. That means, you know what? Hey, this was a good thing. So people out there are on the fence, if you've listened to this episode and you haven't watched it yet, sorry we spoiled it, but like definitely check it out. It's on Netflix as of recording, so you don't necessarily have to buy it, but it is certainly worth it if you decide to. But yeah, and just to speak on that scene a little bit, that was such a great scene because you're getting the character dynamic of the two of them talking while at the same time in the background that's all happening and you're not hearing anything. You're just kind of like seeing you're just seeing his back in the flames. So it's this very intense graphic thing is happening, but it's just kind of like showing you it's doing so much visually while you're also getting information from them, just they're speaking, but you're just kind of and the movie does that a few times where there'll be one thing happening in the foreground and something entirely different in the background that the characters aren't noticing, but we are. And it's establishing all this information really economically in a really smart and often very funny way. And I thought that was a great example of that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So one last question before we go here, and because you brought up, you had a good point that I didn't really think of, that there actually have been some successful adaptations from these shows from the '60s and whatnot. Do you have a favorite movie that's based on one of these old shows?
Probably, I mean, my go-to is to say Star Trek because it's
Right.
like
It's
Star Trek is
great.
my
Yeah.
number one. But besides Star Trek, I would have to say 21 Jump Street, even though it came out in the 80s and not the
Hmm.
60s, but it's definitely one of my favorite movies that came out. They only had two sequels, and even the sequel is good, 22 Jump Street.
Yeah.
And
Which I
so,
just saw for the first time recently, and it's hilarious.
yeah, it's so funny, and I'm surprised they didn't make another sequel. So
Mhm.
that's a good series. That was a good movie. Surprising because
Mhm.
I would have thought that they when I first heard about it, and the trailers kind of let you know there was going to be a comedy, and so
Mhm.
there's my initial disappointment. It's like, oh, they're because it's like when I watched it when I was growing up, I treated it as like a serious drama, but at the time I was
Mhm.
only like 15 or 16 years old when it came out, but it was like to me it was like serious. It was like hydra. It's like somebody's watching like Saint Elsewhere, and an
Right.
older person is watching like Hill Street Blues. And I watched 21 Jump Street. I was a huge fan of that show. So when it became theatrical, they're turning it into a comedy. But I'm such a huge fan, I decided to go see it, and I mean, it was incredible what they did with it. I really enjoyed it. So I would say, like, besides Star Trek, it would have to be
Mhm.
21 Jump Street, and I guess after that, it's The Fugitive.
Yeah, Fugitive's great. Yeah. Yeah, no, do you have, like, a favorite Star Trek or favorite movie version of Star Trek?
I'm with everybody else when I say, like, my favorite Star Trek movie is well, not everybody else, but with a lot of people, Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. So I really
Yeah,
like most of those original movies
yeah.
because there's another podcast, and they ask the question, "What's your home Trek?" Because there are so many different
Mm.
versions, and basically that's the version of the question that you're asking,
Yeah.
and they're called Green Shirts, and well, it's
Oh,
one
okay.
podcast called Green Shirts, and there's another podcast called Open Pike Night, and they're the same guys. So,
That's cool.
so I would say that my home Trek is the original series
Mm.
because that was the Star Trek that I was introduced to. I saw that when I was growing up. The very first episode was it's like I only saw partially, but I was so enraptured by it. But just seeing part of the episode made me a fan of the show. So,
Yeah, yeah.
and I've been a fan of the show ever since. So my favorite movie series, I think, would be that that series of movies after the show had been canceled.
Mhm.
And the funny thing about that is not all of those are good. Like they have
Yeah.
two really it's six movies and two of them are really bad. Like the Star Trek the motion picture. It's like it's not it's not bad in the sense that it's horrible art. It's just boring.
Yeah,
They're getting the
it's
2000
weird, it's a weird movie.
yeah, they're doing the 2001 is
Right.
2001 A Space Odyssey. What's it called? The Space Odyssey?
Yeah,
I'm
2001: A
getting
Space Odyssey, yeah.
yeah. So they're using that aesthetic, and that was super dull. And the only the reason I watched that is because oh my characters are back, but
Yeah.
it's like this story isn't doing anything for me. And then Star Trek Five, which was directed by William Shatner, which is that was an actually bad movie. And I know that there are people that defend that movie, and I leave it to you to have that movie, but it's really bad and annoying. It's like
Yeah, yeah, I loved that when I was a kid, but I have not rewatched it in probably 25 years, if not more, so I'm like, I really wanna, because I know that was the one that always gets clowned on, so it's like, I gotta rewatch that at some point and see how it holds up,
yeah.
because
It's probably
yeah.
not as bad as I remember, but I'm probably going to there was a guy, a guest of the show that
Mm.
that's his favorite movie. That's his favorite Star Trek movie.
Interesting.
So I'm like, well, I gotta do a rewatch with that guy because
Yeah,
even though
yeah.
I'm not passionate about that movie, I know that he is.
Yeah.
And and like I said, if I rewatch it, it's probably not going to be as bad as I remember. And
Mhm,
then within the six movies, there's the Genesis trilogy. That's Star Trek 2, Star
mhm,
Trek 3, and Star Trek 4.
yeah.
I really love those movies. And then Star Trek 6 is one of the best movies
Mm,
of any of the Star Trek.
yeah.
So yeah, that would be my favorite movie series.
Yeah, I mean, I love the Star Trek movies too. I was introduced to them before I was introduced to the show. They're great stuff, and I think that I love the original ones, and then also I have a soft spot for the Kelvin timeline. You know, the ones that started with the '09 movie. I think that movie does really well what this movie is doing, where it takes this property and it gives it a reboot. So unlike the old Trek movies, which are continuations, it's like it's starting fresh with the same characters, with the same premise, but with new actors and stuff like that. I think it does a really good job of that. That's something that can be a tricky line to walk, but I think that the new Star Trek movies do it well. Yeah, I think you named a lot of good ones, like The Fugitive, like 21 Jump Street. You'd mentioned Starsky and Hutch earlier, which does the same thing, where it takes it and makes it a comedy. I think that's a really funny movie. Get Smart is also another really funny movie. I think is based on one of those old, spy shows. That one was also comedy originally, I believe. So, and
Yeah.
then another underrated one I would say is The A-Team. That's a movie that I really liked that movie. I think it is a movie that, I mean, I haven't watched it since I saw it in theaters, but I remember really enjoying it. So I think that also did a good job of kind of taking this beloved property and giving it a fresh coat of paint. But yeah, I don't know. It's weird. Sometimes people show up for these things and sometimes they don't. So this was unfortunately one of the times they didn't. But
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
especially the A-Team. That was a really good movie. I really enjoyed the A-Team. It's like when I realized that they weren't making a sequel because they obviously had
hmm
set it up to make a sequel to those, and they never did. I was like, oh, I had guessed that it didn't do that well at the box office, but I really enjoyed that movie. I
hmm
was because it's like without being like the same as
hmm
the original TV show, it took the elements of the TV show and they updated it and it just
hmm
made it exciting and fun to watch. And it was like all the characters were there. Like they didn't change the characters, which was key. So because
Yeah.
they all had very distinct characteristics, and their relationship is what makes the show works and what made the movie
hmm
work. And they kept that, and it's like, why didn't the movie work? Like, well, why didn't it make more money? Right.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
but sometimes you just got to enjoy some of these things. Sometimes it's
Right.
it's just gonna be us.
Yeah. Because I do honestly, I think one thing that hurts these movies sometimes is it's like there's a weird like uncanny valley, I feel like, of popularity where it's like if the original thing was not that popular, you can make a thing and like people will go see it. Because it's like nobody has that fun. They're like, okay, cool. Like I vaguely remember that. Let's go see it or whatever. Like I know it didn't do super well, but one that came out this past year, The Fall Guy. People liked that movie
Oh
a lot.
yeah,
I thought it
yeah.
was pretty good.
I
Or
I enjoyed that movie.
Right, it's a good movie. Or on the other side, if something is super massively popular like Star Trek, everybody's going to go see it. But I think that like the stuff in the middle where there's like these old heads are like, "They changed it, it's not the same as when I was a kid." Like it's not popular enough to bring everybody out, and it's not niche enough that like people will kind of just be like, "Yeah, whatever." It's like, who cares? If it falls in that middle zone like this one did, I think ends up hurting the movie a little bit. I don't know.
I don't know. I think what I always like to say is that I think it's just the story.
Mhm.
It really is the story is going to carry the movie through regardless of what its origin is. And it's like I said, it's it doesn't have a particularly different challenge than any other movie that's being put out. So you'll have like sequels, and sometimes sequels do well, and sometimes sequels don't do well at all. Sometimes the sequels will bite the dust, and people think that well sequels are guaranteed, but they're not guaranteed. They're a better
Mhm.
bet. They're more they might have an edge because it's a property that people recognize, but they're not guaranteed to be a success. You have the thing with legacy sequels, like you had Top Gun Maverick, which was
Mhm.
did bonkers at the box office. Is like, and that was totally unexpected. And then there was another legacy sequel that came out that didn't do quite as well. Like it
Mhm.
had been like 20 years between the original movie and the sequel, and it didn't do as well. I think The Matrix Revelations or whatever it was called.
Oh,
I
yeah.
think that was the one that didn't do quite as well. And the problem well, the thing with The Matrix is a unique situation because nobody wanted to make that movie.
Yeah, no. Matrix Resurrections. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, the Matrix
Yeah.
Resurrection. So the
Yeah.
studio it was a movie that the studio wanted, but none of the
Mhm.
creatives wanted because as
Yeah.
far as they were concerned, that story was told already. So they felt that, well, if we have to make this movie and they're gonna give us total creative freedom, then
Yeah.
we're going to make the movie that we're gonna make a statement about being forced to make
Yeah.
this movie.
Yeah, yeah. That movie,
And
it's interesting better more than it is good, I think. It
yeah,
touches on
yeah,
some really
yeah.
interesting stuff, It's a movie that was really a victim of the pandemic in a lot of ways, where they started shooting it and then they had to stop shooting for like a year, and then it came out like streaming same day. So that's a movie that would be interesting to talk about at some point, because there's a lot there, and I don't love all of what it does, but like all of the Wachowski movies, it's really ambitious, and I love that it's really going for it. But yeah, and I'll always respect a movie like that it's going for it rather than one that plays it safe. But yeah, man, this was a lot of fun. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks
Before
for
you
having me.
go, yeah, of course. Before you go, where can people find you? Where can people find your podcast?
Well, Backflick Cinema, the podcast, is wherever you listen to podcasts. If wherever you listen to this show, you can find Backflick Cinema. And I even have an audio only version on YouTube. And I'm on social media under most social media handles like Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, um, X, and that's Twitter, isn't it? Threads, that's the one I was thinking about. I'm at all those places at Backflick Cinema. So if you want to drop a line, if you want to write an email, at fanmail@backflickcinema.com. Oh, also, I have a website, backflickcinema.com. Go there and check out. I don't have any artwork there, but I do have a couple of articles. So you can go there and you can read some articles. You can find the podcast there. And that's it. That's about it. The podcast, the articles, I have an about me. You can find out a little bit about me. And I have some stores. I have a store where you can buy merch. I have that. So those are the things going on at the website.
Yeah, definitely. Anybody listening, go check that out. It's a lot of fun. I was checking out your website earlier today, and it looks really well done. I definitely need to spruce up my website to get it on par with that. So good stuff. Right. But yeah, anybody out there who's listening, thank you for listening, and you can find more info about this podcast at underratedmoviepodcast.com. We also have a Patreon, so if you want to get more of stuff from Underrated, you can check it out there by listening to episodes a week early and ad-free. We also do a bonus podcast, wrapping up season 1 of the bonus podcast that I was doing, which is called Underdogs, which focuses on a sports movie once a month. Next year, I'm taking a brief hiatus, but we're going to be doing another bonus podcast, and it's going to be called Across the Second Dimension, where we look at films that were originally made and shot in 3D and watching them to see how they hold up in 2D. So that's all there. You can also check me out on my Marvel podcast, which comes out whenever there's a new Marvel or MCU thing, called Infinity Stones and Dragon Bones. And then the last one I want to mention is that I do a podcast every other Monday. So on Mondays when this doesn't come out, I do one with my buddy Damien called Midnight Film Society, where we review whatever, it's kind of more of a what we've been watching type show. So yeah, if anybody listening wants to check any of that out, I would be very grateful. If you can give the show 5 stars on however you're listening to that really helps the show out quite a bit. Write a review helps out even more. Or if you just want to tell somebody about the show, getting the word out is really important for independent shows like this. So thank you all so much for listening. And Zoe, one more time, thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me. Thanks again.